Hey guys, it's Dani. Today we are talking about watering orchids. Many of you have asked me how much time does it take to water all of my orchids? How do I do this? How many orchids do I actually have? And since I did a head count this morning and discovered that I have 440 orchids, oh my goodness, I think this is an important subject to talk about. And well, to be honest, it doesn't really take me all that long to water them. If I am in a hurry, I can water them in about an hour. How about that? And well, I'm gonna tell you all about it today. Before we get into the subject though, if you're not really acquainted with my grow room and my channel, I do have a grow room tour that I recently filmed. You'll find it somewhere on the screen in an info card or in the description below. You can pause this video, watch that first if you want to have an idea of what's going on, and then return to this video for the watering discussion. So with all of that said, let's start actually with the very beginning, because in order for me to water like I do, I need to pay attention to the setup. As many of you know, at the moment my default medium for orchids is a mix between bark and sphagnum moss. Some of them will have a few fillers such as leca, but I am slowly but surely starting to give up adding other materials due to the very warm climate I live in. And well, this combination works out pretty great for all of the orchids that I own, because I do not actually have very weird or with very specific culture needs orchids. Sure, there are a few exceptions, but the vast majority of my orchids are your usual suspects: Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, Oncidiums, Phalaenopsis orchids, and species which are actually pretty easy to grow in home conditions and in this type of setup. Of course, there are the Vandas as well, but we'll get to those. So from the get-go, I have some sort of uniformity when it comes to the medium and the setup. This doesn't mean that all of the orchids have the same watering requirements. Some of them do really need to stay more moist than others. So how do I do that using the same medium? Simple, by working with the ratios. When I repot water-loving orchids such as Oncidiums or Oncidium intergenerics and other orchids, I make sure to add just a little bit more sphagnum moss, since this is the medium which retains the water. Bark doesn't retain as much water, but it provides air, which is an element all of my orchids need. For orchids which can tolerate drought a lot better, such as the Cattleyas, I do still mix in sphagnum moss because I still need water retention, but I hope you can see in a lower ratio. This orchid with more sphagnum moss cannot tolerate the same amount of dryness as this orchid. So when it's time to water, this orchid will already be completely dry, while this orchid will be almost completely dry. And it is the way that I managed to water both of these orchids at the same time and still maintain them healthy. But working with the ratio between bark and sphagnum moss is not the only thing I do to help me out with watering. And if you've watched any of my recent repottings, let's say for the past year or so, you might have noticed that the first layer which I put down in the pot is sphagnum moss. All of my orchids have a layer of sphagnum moss at the bottom of their pots. This is not random, because when I water, I don't actually take the orchid, bring it to the sink, or fill up the decorative pot and then dump out the water. No, that is solely for flushing, which I don't do very often actually. I don't need to. How I water is by using a spray pump, which I will demonstrate in a little while, and I control the amount of water that I pour through the pot. Now, what happens to the excess? Because yes, there will be excess. I am not getting rid of it. I am counting on the medium to absorb it and deliver it to the plant. When I pour water through the pot, not everything gets wet. It simply doesn't have time. But if I leave a layer of sphagnum moss on the bottom, I make sure that all of that water that falls in the decorative pot or the dish is absorbed back by that sphagnum moss, because it's very wicking. And since that sphagnum moss is connected with other pieces of moss through the pot, you might not be able to notice them, but when you see a repotting that I do, which I will share a link down below too, you'll understand everything is connected. So when that lower layer is super wet, it starts to deliver the water to the upper layers of the moss, which in return will wet the bark as well and will deliver water to the roots. So I am relying on that pool of water. I welcome it. But in order for it to work and not having an orchid that simply sits in water with the bark layer decomposing, I need to put a layer of sphagnum moss at the bottom. This is the only way this setup works with the way that I water. And the way that I water is by using a spray pump. I came up with this idea almost 4 years ago when I moved here. I had the Ceramis and the clay pots medium. I knew they were very wicking, so there was no point to actually go at the sink. The best way to bring the sink to the orchid is not by using a watering can, but a spray pump, because this can hold 8 liters. And there are bigger sprayer pumps on the market as well, but I need to be able to lift them as well. So I'll link it down below to the video that I made then, because I still have the same nozzle that I did in that video, which, yeah, you cannot see. There you go. I had to customize a little bit this nozzle to deliver a faster flow of water. Through the years, the pumps changed a little bit because some broke, but the nozzle never changed. It's the very same one that I did in that video. And ever since then, I did see quite a lot of newer YouTube channels using this method. So if I managed to inspire any of them, I am happy, because this really changes the idea of watering and how hassling it can be. So I will demonstrate on an orchid which doesn't have a decorative pot, just so you see how water flows. And that is pretty much it. Now, it is winter now, and the quantity of water that I put here is very, very tiny. This is because it's not very hot. The water lingers for quite a few days now. So I don't have to have a lot of water in the tray. In the summertime though, I make sure to water quite a lot more. I shall demonstrate and remove the water from the tray now. Let's be a little bit more careful with this. The pump is full, but in the summertime, I water like this. And you can see there is quite a lot of water in the tray. I can assure you that within 24 hours, all of this water disappears because it is absorbed by the medium, which hopefully you can see now it's not properly wet, but it will get wet. And apart from this, there is a high degree of evaporation in my grow room due to the warmth. Also, I have fans running, particularly in summertime, all of the time. In the nighttime, I open all of the windows and refresh the air. It is always breezy here, so there's always air movement in the grow room. Coupled with the high temperatures, this in summer, this is nothing. Being that all of my pots have a layer of sphagnum moss at the bottom, I can also do this. Just put some water in the dish and wait for that sphagnum moss to absorb it. Do you see that already the level is changing? Well, I'm gonna tell you a few ideas and you'll see this water disappearing before your eyes. When I first started this technique, I relied on the fact that my pot, which was clay, and the Ceramis, which again was clay, would absorb the water. At some point, I did give up the clay pots. I started using plastic pots once again in different setups. We had semi-hydro. Again, I could use this technique because if you remember, semi-hydro has that little reservoir. Well, I just placed the pot on top of a tray, watered from above until I saw a little bit of water coming through the drainage holes of the reservoir, and hey presto, I watered the orchid. Again, no need to go to the sink. Then I stopped using that setup and I went for self-watering. Again, I could use this technique because self-watering had a reservoir. It just didn't have that drainage hole on the side. So again, there was no need to bring my orchid to the sink. I could fill up the reservoir using this technique and from time to time, obviously flush the orchid if I so desired. And well, when it came to organic medium, PS, it is gone. So when it came to organic medium and plastic pots, oh my goodness, how do I arrange the setup so that I can use the same technique again, because it's so much better? And well, I opted to use sphagnum moss. In my opinion, when it comes to organic means, sphagnum moss is the most wicking and the most water absorbing of all materials. There are replacements on the market which are not organic. One of them is rock wool, one of them is synthetic, but they're simply not as absorbent. I have videos on those as well. I tested them. I will share them with you down below in the description and also in an info card on the screen. So honestly, the only reason why this works is because of the sphagnum moss. Bark will never be as absorbent. This will not work with bark. Yes, you will get the medium wet, but the water will remain in the dish. It will not be absorbed by the bark. And the bad thing is you will degrade the lower levels of the bark much faster, which is not something you want. Soggy, degraded bark is never good for orchid roots. It can become too acidic, it can become suffocating. In this setup, bark is here to provide the very, very needed air. But the real hero, in my opinion, is the sphagnum moss. When I water from above, I flush a little bit, let's say the medium. I also make sure to wet a little bit the roots that are just growing on the top. So that is good for the orchid. The water will drain in the dish and then it will get reabsorbed once again. So I do believe it's better to water from the top, even though the medium can absorb water from the bottom as well. We're not growing African violets. These are orchids. They have absolutely no problem if they get a little bit wet here at the base. As long as they don't stay in soggy, degraded medium, everything should be absolutely fine, even here at the top. And also as long as the pseudobulbs or the axis is not buried in the medium. So being that watering each individual orchid takes a few seconds, you can imagine that I finish watering all of my orchids within the hour if I'm in a hurry, really. It's not 1 hour because I do like to check up the orchids. Sometimes I pick one up, see if everything is okay, see how the roots are growing since all of my orchids are potted in transparent pots now. So I do take my time because I want to enjoy my hobby. But there are those days when I'm just so swamped with work that all I have time to do is this. And this works out just fine for me. So even if I have 400 plus orchids, it still takes me about an hour or a little more than an hour to water them if I'm in a hurry. So how do I fertilize orchids using this method? Simple. The water that I use can contain fertilizer and I just water in the same way. At this point, I do have an eye formed for how much I should fertilize. There are some orchids which I don't fertilize. Some of them have a dormancy. I rarely water them. Some of them simply don't like a lot of fertilizer. So I do prepare a different batch for certain orchids. I cannot say I follow the directions of the label of my fertilizer just like they are. I adapt them. Sometimes I have orchids which are recovering and there's no point to use a full dosage of fertilizer. There aren't enough roots to pick up all of that fertilizer and I don't want buildup, especially because I don't want to flush very, very often. So even if I don't run the water through the pot and make a proper flush, I don't need to because I don't over fertilize. Now the water that I use is a combination between tap water and reverse osmosis water. You'll find links to my osmosis system down below in the description. I have not changed my water source, let's say, but I am seeing that adding a little bit of tap water actually improves some orchids, especially the Paphiopedilums, and also it makes me a little bit more economic with osmosis water, which, as you might know, takes a while to be produced. And that's actually another reason why I have to be so economical with my watering technique. Osmosis water takes a lot of time to be produced. It uses tap water, it wastes resources to some degree, and if I start to just splash water everywhere and not be economical at all, well, I would have a big water bill and I would just waste water for no good reason when I know I can come up with a much smarter system. So that was the idea behind this. I'm trying to be economical with my osmosis water and the flushes are done with tap water. Usually I put all of my orchids on my terrace, I get my garden hose and start to shower everybody. I usually flush them in the warmer months, not in the winter. Whatever water I dump just flows in the garden below my terrace, waters the trees, waters the plants, and hey presto, no water is being thrown away. Now the frequency of watering, of course, is determined mainly by the seasons and by the environment. Obviously in the winter time I can get away with not watering for 10 days. But in the summertime, things are really not as simple, even if I make sure to leave water in the decorative pot or in the dish. It's simply that warm and that ventilated. So in the summer, I might water every 5 days, while in the winter, I might water every 10 days. There are a few orchids which require more attention, for example, the Tolumnias. They might get watered every 5 days, even in the winter, because they're potted in very tiny pots, which, let me just show you. There you go, there they are. Even if I would pot them in pure sphagnum moss, they would still dry out faster than all of my other orchids because the pot is dramatically smaller than everything else. So even if I stuff them with moss, they would still dry out before that pot, for example, because that's how the laws of physics work. As for the vandas, well, I decided to pot them. I know that on YouTube, I just told you that I'm thinking of potting them, but there's such a thing as pre-recording videos. And when I do the Orchids in Bloom videos, I pre-record them even weeks before I publish them. So that pre-recording was about 2 weeks ago. And in the span of 2 weeks, I potted all of my vandas, which is a thing that is not necessary. Not everybody can benefit from them being grown potted. I'll share with you down below a video that I made on my vandas. For the past almost 2 years, they were in baskets, in wooden baskets, and everything was great. But as they grew, and this is valid for all orchids, and I've always had this happen, you start out with an orchid being okay in its medium and its basket. As it grows and grows multiple roots and then blooms, it requires more and more and more water. As it grows, the roots will take over the pot and they will absorb the water much faster than they did when you initially potted the orchid. So that's what happened to the vandas as well. Initially they were fine, I could keep up with their watering, but inevitably they grew. And vandas have very thick roots, they absorb a lot of water, they're thirsty plants, especially when they're in bloom, especially when they are quite big. So I had to do something after a year and a half, almost 2, of keeping them in the pots. This summer I put medium just to maintain more water. At first it was okay, then they overgrew kinda that environment as well, and they needed more and more water. So what I did was I potted them and I glued a tray with hot glue just to maintain that water and pretty much allow me to water the vandas just like I water the other orchids as well. The good thing with hot glue is that it's not permanent. I can detach these and I can remove the hot glue easily from plastic, especially from very glossy surfaces. So if I don't like this setup, I can remove this tray and I can go for something else. But so far, this is working so great. I had so many vandas that started to get dehydrated. I showed you in the videos as well, especially the ones that were in bloom. I simply could not keep up with that. So here we go. The vandas are now potted as well, and they are watered in the exact same way that I water all of my orchids. I've been spoiled with that spray pump. But hey, it's working out just fine. So that is about it on my watering technique. This is how I water my orchids. Even if I move them outside, they still go out with the pots. And it's just easy. It allows me not to share water, which is something very important to me. In this way, every orchid has its own water. I am efficient and I don't waste water for no good reason. I am efficient with time, with space, with my physical effort at the end of the day. These are the important aspects of orchid growing when you are a home grower. And my channel pretty much is dedicated to home growers. So I hope that this video gave you a few tips, inspired you to maybe try out something else if you indeed have issues with watering orchids, with caring for them. There is a physical aspect to this hobby that we don't really talk about, but I personally have issues with my back. I've had them since I was very young, and watering my orchids and moving them around so much hasn't really improved the situation. So all the more reason to come up with some techniques that would make life easier. There's no shame in simply not wanting to put that much effort into your orchids, but wanting to have quite a collection of orchids. It's absolutely possible, and I just hope this video gave you some ideas. But always remember to try out first with 1 or 2 orchids, see how things go, because our environments are just so different that things might not work in the same way for you. You might have to tweak a little bit that setup or that medium or the mixture depending on the materials you have available. Of course, you don't have to use plastic pots. You can use clay pots if you love them, if you're okay with them. You can absolutely use these watering techniques with them as well. So in the end, just adapt things to your life and to your environment. Get the idea, get inspiration, and then make it your own. It's absolutely fine. So I hope this was useful or entertaining for you guys, and you know the drill. Like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. Even African violets, why not? And if you wish to support the channel, do consider visiting the merch store down below. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!